You are standing in the churn of a Victorian marketplace, the kind that smells of wet mud, spilt ale, and manure from beasts tethered nearby. The morning fog hasn't yet lifted, clinging to the air like a damp blanket, but the crowd is already alive with noise. Butchers bark prices for their meat, farmers shout over pigs squealing, and vendors rattle their coins as mugs of beer change hands. Then a ripple moves through the square. Heads turn. The usual cries soften into murmurs. Something unusual is happening, a spectacle, though not an illegal one, and not entirely unfamiliar. At first you expect a trader leading an animal on a rope halter, but when the crowd parts, your stomach knots. It is not livestock that stumbles forward. It is a woman. The coarse rope is tied around her waist like a leash. Her husband marches ahead, jerking the halter when she falters in the sticky mud. Her eyes fix on the ground, her cheeks flush with humiliation. Some of the onlookers jeer. Others take long sips of beer, amused as though this were carnival entertainment. A man steps up, calling out bids. Coins flash, hands shoot into the air. The woman is displayed, not embraced, priced, not cherished. The crowd roars with each shouted number. The auctioneer slaps palms in mock ceremony, and just like that her life is transferred. Sold to whichever bidder claims her with coin and ale. This is no back-alley crime, no hidden shame. It unfolds in broad daylight, in front of townsfolk, neighbors, even children. And it is tolerated. This is not love, nor marriage, nor justice. This was wife-selling, one of the darkest customs of Victorian England. Before we continue this journey into the shadows of history, take a moment to like this video and subscribe for more hidden truths from the past. And let me know in the comments where in the world you're listening from. It amazes me how curiosity unites us across continents and centuries. To understand the grotesque spectacle of wife-selling, we must first step inside the world of Victorian marriage. Behind the lace curtains and the sermons about morality, the law itself consigned women to little more than property. Under the doctrine of coverture, a married woman ceased to exist as a legal individual. Her wages belonged to her husband. Her children belonged to her husband. Even her body, by law and by custom, was his. She could not own property in her own right, could not sign contracts, and had no separate identity in the eyes of courts. Marriage was celebrated as holy union, but beneath the vows lay a stark reality. It was ownership. For the wealthy elite, there were at least theoretical escapes. Expensive appeals of Parliament, private bills, or annulments demanded through influence. But for ordinary people, especially the laboring poor, there was no legal outlet. To separate from one's spouse in Victorian England was a privilege only the rich could afford, until Matrimonial Causes Act of 1857 created a civilian divorce court. The price of dissolving a marriage was astronomical, often tens of thousands of pounds in today's money. It was designed deliberately to be beyond the grasp of common hands. And so, trapped in brutal, loveless, or violent unions, many working-class couples turned instead to a ritual that had the legitimacy of tradition, if not of law: wife-selling. In villages and market towns across the country, men and women acted out a grotesque parody of the marriage ceremony to unmake the vows they could not undo legally. With halter and rope, with coins and beer, with jeering neighbors watching, a woman was sold like cattle to a new husband. What shocks modern sensibilities is not only the cruelty of the act, but its tolerance. Wife-selling was rarely hidden. It was performed in marketplaces, outside taverns, sometimes even recorded in local papers. Neighbors turned out to see it, sometimes cheering, sometimes mocking, occasionally even treating it as festivity. It survived not as an aberration but as a custom, crude, humiliating, and disturbingly normalized as a folk divorce. The cultural irony was staggering. Victorian England prided itself on being the seat of empire, exporting Christian morality to the far corners of the globe. It censored literature, outlawed public indecency, and held itself aloft as a model of virtue. But in its own marketplaces, women were bought and sold under the pretense of popular tradition. Respectable society embraced pearl-handled teacups in the drawing room, while looking the other way when a laborer tied a rope around his wife's waist and ushered her into the village square for public bidding. It was a contradiction at the very heart of the age. A society obsessed with appearances, with piety and politeness, but one that tolerated humiliation in broad daylight. This was England under Queen Victoria. An empire at its zenith, a nation enslaved propriety and complicit in cruelty. By the time the ritual began, the entire town was usually aware of it. A husband would lead his wife through the muddy market streets, a leather strap or rough rope fastened around her waist, sometimes even looped around her neck like reins. It was not subtle, it was a performance. Crowds gathered as eagerly as if they had come to see a fair or a prize fight. Children craned their necks. Hawkers abandoned their stalls, and the tavern doors flew open. The spectacle was theater, humiliation as public entertainment. The wife was often marched directly to the center of the marketplace, beneath the hanging sign of a tavern, or onto the steps of a livestock pen. There she was set up for auction. An auctioneer might call loudly, or the husband himself would act a part, boasting of her habits, mocking her flaws, sometimes even bargaining over household chores, as though she were an animal with particular strengths or defects. Then came the bidding. Coins were raised, hats tipped, prices shouted. The purchaser might be a lover waiting eagerly for legitimacy, a neighbor willing to take her in, or simply a stranger amused at the idea of acquiring a wife for the price of supper. Whether she stood silent, wept openly, or laughed nervously at the absurdity, the woman had little control over how much her life would be valued. When the deal was struck, it was sealed not with legal parchment, but with ale. Pints of beer were ordered, poured, and shared. A handshake marked the contract, and in some cases, a crude receipt or bill of sale was scrawled on paper, witnessed by amused townsfolk. To the participants, the ritual was binding. They believed, or pretended to believe, that the act granted legitimacy, that it dissolved one union and created another. In truth, the courts of England considered it nonsense. Judges repeated endlessly that wife-selling had no legal force. And yet, the performance endured because it provided what the law denied: closure. For poor couples unable to pay thousands for parliamentary divorce, this market square humiliation was their grim version of freedom. What struck observers, and ought to startle us even now, is the pageantry of cruelty. Women led on ropes before jeering crowds. Laughter raised at their expense. A ritual of degradation disguised as transaction, spectacle masking itself as justice. The law did not sanction it. Yet society accepted enough to watch, to cheer, and to turn human misery into theater. Though we associate it most with Victorian England, wife-selling's roots stretch back at least to the 1700s. Reports appear in parish registers and local newspapers, sometimes wrapped in scandal, sometimes recounted almost casually. These cases show us not only how widespread the custom was, but how varied, ranging from moments of seemingly cheerful collusion to raw spectacles of weeping humiliation. Together, they reveal the desperate landscape of working-class marriage. In some markets, a wife might arrive in surprisingly good spirits. There are accounts of women standing laughing beside their husbands, calling out cheerfully to the crowd, clearly eager to be rid of a man they could not divorce. In certain instances, the buyer was not a stranger at all, but a lover already chosen. The auction was less sale than ceremony, the public justification for a private arrangement. For these few, wife-selling provided something like liberation, crude, humiliating perhaps, but still their only available path to independence. Yet for every such story there are darker echoes. Report exists of women dragged through marketplaces, halters cinched tight, their faces streaked with tears while crowds bargained over them as though they were cattle. Local papers delighted in describing the scenes, dwelling on how cheaply a woman might be sold. Sometimes for as little as a few shillings, sometimes accompanied by a quart of ale. The spectacle was meant to amuse. The women's terror, shame, or silence became the punchline. There are ironies buried here that still sting. In some communities, the wife herself pressed for the sale. After all, legal separation required money and influence these couples did not have. To petition Parliament for divorce could cost 10 to 15 years' wages. A marketplace auction was within reach. For a trapped wife with no property rights, no claim to wages, no recourse against cruelty, even the humiliation of public sale might be preferable to remaining bound. She risked everything, dignity, reputation, even safety, for the mere possibility of survival with another man. Occasionally, such stories end almost farcically, with wife, seller, and buyer all repairing to the tavern to drink the ale that sealed the deal. For neighbors, it was sport. For the participants, it was a fragile compromise. And for the woman at its center, it was the only chance at a change of fate. But if some sales had an air of carnival, most bore the darker weight of despair. They were public confessions at the marriage bond, otherwise proclaimed sacred, eternal, and binding by church and crown, held no compassion for the poor. If you were a working-class woman in Victorian England, trapped in a marriage, you did not have a choice. You only had an auction block. What emerges from these early and Victorian-era accounts is not a picture of petty amusement, but of desperation dressed as theater. Wife-selling was not simply cruelty inflicted upon women, though it often was that. It was also a ritual that broadcast, in muddy market squares, the horrifying lack of options for entire classes of people. If the earlier cases carried a faint whiff of comedy, neighbors chuckling in the tavern, husbands shaking hands over mugs of ale, the more lurid stories reported in the Victorian press exposed the cruelty beneath the laughter. These were not quaint rituals. They were humiliations so raw that even hardened journalists paused in disgust. One such account from the mid-1800s described a sale in Yorkshire. A husband led his wife into market with a halter looped around her neck, the crowd shouting as he advertised her qualities. She was sold for a single shilling, cheaper than the pigs rooting in the mud behind them. The newspaper noted with bitter irony that a good pig fetched 10 shillings. The woman's value was pegged lower by society that already considered her husband's property. In another notorious case in Devon, the bidding reached sixpence before the crowd realized the purchaser was a woman's own lover. Cheers erupted when he slapped the husband's hand and led her away, halter still in place. To the neighbors, it was a punchline. To the woman, it was perhaps a lifeline. But the image remains grotesque, a supposed romance played out under the trappings of animal trade. Not all sales ended so tidily. Some spiraled into violence or absurdity. Clergymen occasionally intervened, scandalized that couple performed this parody of divorce in God's daylight. In Lancashire, a priest stood between husband and buyer, declaring the entire act void. The crowd booed, the couple retreated, only for the sale to be completed quietly at a tavern hours later, away from the preacher's eyes. It revealed where true authority lay, not in law or pulpit, but in the collective acceptance of neighbors willing to treat flesh and blood as barter. Even more bizarre are accounts of women purchasing themselves. In Dorset, a wife allegedly pressed her own coins into her husband's palm and proclaimed herself free, leaving both bidders and onlookers stunned. For working-class women, this was revolution disguised as sale. In a society that offered them no avenue for autonomy, some seized a ritual intended to degrade them and twisted it into self-emancipation. But it was rare, and those rare moments only underline a darker truth, that most women were unable to escape without the humiliation of being handed from one man to another. The Victorian press relished these details. Papers printed them with scandalized relish, wringing their hands at England's moral decline, while ensuring circulation soared. Reporters described jeering crowds, idle laughter, children trailing behind haltered wives as though it were theater. They made light of the price tags but seldom confronted the deeper obscenity, a society that condemned prostitution, censored novels, and adorned itself in religious virtue could simultaneously tolerate women being auctioned like cattle. Here lies the painful irony. England proclaimed itself the empire of progress, the guardian of decency against a debased world. Yet in its marketplaces, wives were sold for less than the cost of a farmer's boots. England preached morality, but in taverns and town squares, it auctioned wives like swine. To read these accounts of wife selling and then place them against the gleaming mirror of respectable Victorian society is to confront one of history's cruelest hypocrisies. This was an England that prided itself on rectitude, that draped its empire in lace and scripture. Sermons thundered about chastity, bishops bewailed the dangers of lust, and public morality was policed with unforgiving zeal. Yet while novels were censored and prostitutes were punished by law, working-class women could be marched through mud with a rope halter around their waist and sold like cattle in a marketplace. The clergy, so quick to pour fire on the sins of the street, often turned their eyes aside. Some gasped and protested yes. But many more looked the other way, dismissing the ritual as vulgar comedy among the poor. Judges and magistrates, too, recorded the cases with mock disgust. Bench books contained notations dripping with sarcasm, a curious practice, a most improper display. But in the same breath, those same courts denied women the chance of legal escape. It is easy to condemn a spectacle after the fact, harder to grant the dignity of divorce. This was the geometry of Victorian injustice. Wealthy men shielded by law, poor men and women abandoned to humiliation. Respectable society chuckled at its caricatures of rural backwardness, while ignoring the desperation that birthed the practice. Her body was bound by rope, one observer wrote bitterly, but her spirit also bound by law. And so the pattern persisted, not because people believed wife-selling was lawful. They knew it was not, but because poverty and patriarchy wove it in the fabric of daily life. A laborer could neither afford nor access London's halls of power to dissolve a marriage. A wife in misery, stripped of rights to her children and wages, had nowhere else to turn. In such a vacuum of compassion, cruelty presented itself as solution. Thus the irony was complete. Behind the polished glass of Victorian drawing rooms, society congratulated itself on its civility while tacitly endorsing rituals that degraded women in plain daylight. The empire presented itself as beacon of Christian morality, yet in its very markets enacted a theater that revealed the truth. Beneath the sermons and silks, England's foundations rested on inequity and humiliation. By the mid-198th century, England was changing. Literacy spread. Newspapers flooded every corner of the country, and with them came scandal. What had once been tolerated as a rough custom among the poor now became fodder for national outrage. Local cases that might once have been laughed off in taverns were suddenly printed in London papers and read by drawing-room families who clutched their pearls in disbelief. Wife-selling, presented in columns alongside foreign atrocities, looked increasingly like a stain on Victorian respectability. It was not moral awakening that began to throttle the ritual. It was shame. Respectable society despised a reminder that beneath its polished manners and empire-wide sermons lay this grotesque folk divorce. To be mocked abroad as a land where women were paraded with halters was intolerable. The country was already embroiled in debates on women's rights, property reform, and religious propriety. To face headlines about marketplaces treating wives like cattle was too much. Then came 1857, and with it the Matrimonial Causes Act, the first real divorce court accessible to ordinary people. It was far from perfect, still tilted in favor of men, but it provided something wife-selling never had, a pathway sanctioned by law rather than laughter. For the first time, the poor could imagine ending a marriage without resorting to the humiliation of a rope. Slowly, numbers dwindled. By the late Victorian era, wife-selling was no longer treated as custom. It was caricature. Newspapers mocked it as a barbaric relic, an embarrassment to be ridiculed rather than repeated. Still, in stubborn pockets of rural England, echoes persisted. There are reports, astonishingly, of wife sales as late as the early 20th century, ghosts of a ritual clinging on in the shadows. Its death was not noble. Wife-selling did not vanish because England suddenly spared compassion for its poor women. It ended because it embarrassed polite society, because it clashed too openly with the self-portrait of an empire devoted to morality. The halter was dropped at last, not out of conscience, but out of shame. When the halters were untied and the coins exchanged, what remained was not liberation, but humiliation. For the women at the center of these grim spectacles, dignity was stripped in the square before the eyes of neighbors and children. Their personal lives, their private anguish, were turned into theater. The jeering backdrop of a society that defined them as property first and people second. Politically, wife-selling was never recognized as law, yet it thrived precisely because the law refused women any escape. In its cruelty, the ritual reflected the deeper order of Victorian society. The patriarch's control, the wife's erasure, the unbreakable chain of coverture. The marketplace rope was only a crude extension of those invisible bonds that tied women to men, to homes, to marriages from which they could not free themselves. And yet its memory endures. You can still trace it through parish records, magistrates' notes written with disdain but careful accuracy, and newspaper columns that half mocked, half profited from the scandal. They are receipts of humiliation, dressed up as ritual, the archival remains of cruelty England liked to pretend never happened. England proclaimed itself the Empire of Progress. Yet here at the tavern door, a woman could still be sold like an ox. Her story, their stories, remind us that history's cruelty rarely wears horns or fangs. More often, it disguises itself in propriety, in civic order, in custom. More often, it wears respectability and a halter tied round the waist. The ghost of wife-selling lingers, not in marketplaces, but in the memory of how society can cloak brutality beneath tradition.